Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Krupinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. And we want to thank you for joining us and spending part of your Earth Day with us for our event. Issues and Ale is a discussion series sponsored by Michigan Radio designed to engage people in conversations about important issues facing Michigan. We invite you to sit back this evening with a beer or the beverage of your choice and enjoy our discussion. The Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation is proud to support this evening's event. The Erb Family Foundation is dedicated to its mission of advancing an environmentally healthy and culturally vibrant Metro Detroit and a flourishing Great Lakes ecosystem. You can find them on the web at erbff.org. We want to thank them for their support. We'd also like to thank all of the Michigan Radio donors in the audience whose support also makes events like these possible. So we are recording tonight's event, and we will also be auto-transcribing it for the hearing impaired. You can enable or disable that by clicking on the transcript box on your screen. Our audience also will be muted during the event, but we will be taking your questions, and we encourage those. You can submit those at any time by using the Q&A box on your screen, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. So our host this evening is Lester Graham. He is the senior reporter of Michigan Radio, and he covers environmental stories for the Environment Report. So here is Lester Graham.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As he mentioned, I'm the lead reporter for the Environment Report. This is actually my second stint covering the environment at Michigan Radio. I covered it 12 years from 1998 to 2010 for first the Great Lakes Radio Consortium, which evolved into the national program, the Environment Report. My colleague, Rebecca Williams, was there with me starting in 2000, and she joins us. She was with the Environment Report until September of 2018, which means she's covered the environment as a journalist longer than anyone else on the panel tonight. Michigan Radio was so impressed it made her one of our editors. Next on the panel is Kelly House, who is the chief reporter for Michigan Environment Watch with the online magazine Bridge Michigan, I'm sorry. She's been in that position for just over a year. Prior to that, she reported on the environment for the Oregonian, which I should note, she did grow up here in Michigan. I just learned today, Kelly, you grew up in Harrison, which for those of you who don't know where that's at, a little north of Clare. Our final panelist is our only non-journalist tonight. Dr. Mike Schreiberg is the Regional Executive Director of the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes Regional Center. He's been with the Federation since 2015. Prior to that, he was Education Director at the Graham Sustainability Institute. He worked there as a lecturer in the Environment and Earth and Environmental Sciences. And Mike, I don't know whether I first interviewed you when you were with the Ecology Center or Environment Michigan. All I know is it was a long time ago.
Yes, it was. Thanks for having me.
So it's been an interesting Earth Day so far. President Joe Biden stated at a virtual climate summit that the U.S. will cut carbon emissions as much as 52%. Governor Gretchen Whitmer announced all state facilities will be using 100% renewable energy by 2025. And the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy has held its first public comments session asking the people of Michigan for their ideas about how to make Michigan carbon neutral by 2050 as requested by the governor. So let's start by hearing from our panelists. What are you keeping an eye on as far as the environment in Michigan or the Great Lakes? Rebecca, let's start with you.
Hi, so I think one of the most notable things this week that I've seen is the Michigan Public Service Commission making the decision that it will consider greenhouse gases in its decision on the Line 5, Enbridge's Line 5 tunnel project. That came out just yesterday, actually.
And Kelly, what are you watching?
Rebecca stole mine.
Well, it's not the only environmental issue.
Yes, exactly. Lots of Line 5 lately as we come up on the May 13th deadline for Governor Whitmer's order for the current pipeline to shut down. So I've been watching a lot of Line 5 issues and just in general reporting a lot along in partnership with Lester on how climate change will play out in the Great Lakes region and what it looks like to prepare ourselves for what we know is coming. So that's been on my mind pretty frequently lately.
Mike, what are you looking at these days?
Yeah, I guess building off of what Kelly said, one of the things that we're seeing is that as we get deeper into this climate crisis, we're seeing patterns that people are seeing as weird, right? I mean, I don't know a better way to describe it. When we're seeing this increases in precipitation, the increases in sort of frequency of what used to be very rare events. And I think it's leading to this shift in public opinion, and some of the actions that we're seeing today are just sort of an outgrowth of that. So people are experiencing it, and I assume we'll get into this more, but it's accelerating so many of the problems that we work in and day out on National Wildlife Federation, from harmful algal blooms to invasive species, shoreline erosion. Climate change is the great accelerator of all of them.
Yeah, the shoreline erosion has been interesting. People have been really up in arms about the height of the water in the Great Lakes. And, you know, it wasn't all that long ago, everybody was worried about how low the levels of the Great Lakes had been. And, you know, it fits into a pattern of these volatile situations that climate change is supposed to be showing, and that's happening. Before we get too much farther into discussion, I just want to say this is Issues and Ale. And I don't know what you guys are drinking, but I decided on this 51K IPA from Black Rock Brewery, which is in Marquette in the UP. Let me do that. That's my choice. Becca, what are you drinking tonight?
I have Archangel. This is from North Peak Brewery up north.
Kelly?
Bell's Two Hearted, can't go wrong. And I'm
No, that is a classic in this state. That's a classic.
Yeah. And speaking of Harrison, this is a koozie from the 125th anniversary of my hometown. So.
Mike, what do you got?
And I swear I didn't coordinate with Kelly, but this is a two-hearted as well. Bell's Brewery, and Larry Bell and Bell's Brewery have been really active on this issue, and things like starting the Great Lakes Business Network. Extraordinarily active on that. So I'm a diehard Bell's fan. I was before, and I'm even more so now.
Well, I've got mine in my actual Issues and Ale pint glass, so I feel like I'm really special tonight. All right, let's get to serious business here. I want to explain something. Part of this is driven by, Kelly mentioned that we're partnering on something. She and I are involved in something called the Great Lakes News Collaborative. It's a coordinated effort that's being supported by the Mott Foundation, and we're working with Michigan Radio and Bridge, Michigan, Detroit Public TV's Great Lakes Now, and the online publication based in Traverse City called Circle of Blue. And we've been looking at how climate change is affecting the Great Lakes and surrounding region, as well as looking at drinking water. In that effort, like I said, I've been working with Kelly, sometimes being fact-checked by Rebecca, and I've had some discussions with Mike and other people involved in preserving the environment to get their perspectives to see what we should be covering, what ought to be covered, and we went from there. So let's talk about that a little bit. Kelly, just give me a couple of the stories that you've been working on in the last several months that you think are really important and undercovered.
So one story, I don't know if I think it's necessarily the most important, but it was an interesting story to me was, I'm really fascinated by this question of how existing problems that we have right now will only be exacerbated by climate change, and the actions that we already know we can and should and need to take to get prepared. So one story I wrote recently dealt with a neighborhood in Detroit that has been repeatedly flooded amid this high water that we've been having. And the big question isn't what needs to be done. We know that you either, reinforce or retreat if you are in a flood-prone area. The question is, how do you pay for it, particularly, in neighborhoods that may or may not have the financial wherewithal? And how do we, as we think about climate change speeding up, what are some of the ethical and practical questions that we need to answer as a society about how we share cost burden and create a situation where we're not abandoning those who maybe don't have the wherewithal, and avoid the sort of everyone for themselves approach that means we don't address the issue and we do end up exacerbating inequality. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about, both because of that story and thinking about, what coverage going forward might look like to tell some of those tales.
you know, the picture that you took of the stream that was there with Detroit Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood on one side and one of the Grosse Pointes on the other side was so dramatic because it was really clear one side was protected well and the other side was left to fend for itself. I thought that was a really interesting photo. Reb, you're the one with the science background among the journalists here. I've been watching and talking to people about how climate change is exacerbating the invasive species problems, and recently did a story about diatoms and how important they are. And I know that you did a paper on Mongolian diatoms. We're talking about diatoms in the Great Lakes and how they're not doing as well as we'd like to see them and being affected by climate change. Could you tell us what diatoms are?
Yeah, so this is from a previous life when I worked in a research lab back in college, and I did work on these tiny microscopic algae, and they are beloved food for a lot of things in the food web. So many things eat them. They're very beautiful. If you've never seen one, you have to look under a high-powered microscope to see them. That's how small they are. But they're very, very, very important part of the food web. And you just did a story, Lester, actually, as you mentioned, that things are changing, right?
Right. The lakes, the EPA Lake Guardian, which is the research ship that the EPA owns, brings on professors from all over the Great Lakes region, and they do a survey a couple of times a year of all 5 Great Lakes. Takes about a month to travel and take samples and do all the measurements they need to. And they're finding that there are some problems with diatoms. You know, the zooplankton eat them, the small fish do, and the other thing that they're really worried about is, you know, the fact that most of the food web has disappeared because of quagga mussels. They're filtering out everything except for the algae that harbors, the microcystis that harbors the stuff that shut down the Toledo water system, the cyanobacteria. And it's really interesting how the quagga mussels are starting to inch into Lake Superior, which has not had a real problem with them. But as Lake Superior warms up a little bit, quagga mussels are starting to get a foothold there. It's really it's this perfect storm of invasive species and disrupting the total biology of the lakes. And it's all being made worse, amplified by climate change. Mike, you guys are in the midst of all of this and trying to inform people and also trying to, you know, inform politicians, policymakers. How's that going?
It's a slow slog, but I feel like we're rounding the corner in some ways. And part in our work, one of the things that we do is bring together different constituencies that care about the outdoors. And hunters and anglers are a huge constituency there, and traditionally far more conservative, much more Republican-leaning group. And one of the things that I've been encouraged by, and the reason I think there's more potential for moving climate-oriented legislation, is that hunters and anglers are beginning to get engaged. And that's because they're seeing these changes in the species, whether it comes out a lot in the fisheries. The cold water species aren't doing nearly as well, or their habitat's changing. And so we're seeing these folks getting involved. On the other hand, we haven't seen major climate legislation, obviously out of Congress, nor at the state level here. So we're still stagnant in a lot of ways, but I'm seeing some signs of progress because of new constituencies that are getting engaged.
Yeah, I just did a piece on inland lakes not too long ago, and they were talking about, you might want to try to fish for this particular kind of fish, like a walleye or something like that, and you might end up finding that you have to switch to catching bass because they like warmer water. And that really shocked me, and I thought, well, how do fishers, anglers think about that? I think anytime you tell an angler or a hunter, look, you're going to have to change your ways if you think you're going to get that fish anymore, it's not going to do any good to stock it anymore because it's not habitable for that cool water fish or that cold water fish that you've been used to catching. That's pretty just, we gardeners are already experiencing that. The people who manage forests are already experiencing that. Now hunters and anglers are starting to see just a little bit of that encroaching on their hobbies, their livelihoods. Are you hearing back about that concern, or is it still early enough that they're not noticing that much?
No, we are hearing that a lot. In fact, we just wrote a mini report called Changing Seasons, which was the observation specifically of hunters and anglers. And actually, even the boating community, we're seeing more blow days on the lakes, meaning where the winds are so high that you're not able to get out and fish generally. The charter fishing boat people who make their living that way track this in particular. So we are definitely seeing that. We're hearing about it. And, it's getting into people's experiences now. It's gone from the sort of theoretical, and maybe we'll see it overseas, to what we're seeing right here. And remember, we're in the region and arguably the state that is, I don't want to say the most insulated, but you see the impacts that are a little less tangible here because we're not on the coastline. We don't have hurricanes. Tornadoes are pretty rare. So our effects are more subtle. And even here, we're seeing them in very, very important ways and in observable ways.
I want to tell everyone we're going to be taking questions soon. So if you want to type in a question in the Q&A, please do. We'll get to as many as we can. I want to ask one more question of our panelists before we start doing that. And that is, what needs to be covered better? Rebecca?
Oh, gosh. I think the more we can do, two fronts. One is really there's so much that we as individuals can and should be doing in terms of battling climate change. What do we do in our own lives? I don't think we can cover that enough. And I think talking about how people can adapt, because climate change is already happening. It's not something in the future. It's going to continue in the future.
That just a few years ago, that was adapting to climate change really angered some environmentalists, because they're saying, look, you're just giving up. Let's deal with the source of the problem rather than adapt to the results of the problem. Do you think that's changed in the last couple of years, 3 years?
I do, actually. I'd be curious to hear what Mike thinks about this, but I think I've really seen a shift in the way people are talking in the last maybe 5 years or so. I feel like we've been hearing a lot more about both of those things at the same time, mitigation and adaptation. How do we slow the pace of climate change, and how do we adapt at the same time? Because both things can happen at the same time.
Kelly, what's undercovered?
Well, speaking for myself, I know that I would like to do a better job moving forward of covering sort of some of those.
She says that, and she, along with her colleagues at Bridge, are some of the most prolific writers I have ever seen. They're cranking out a lot of stories really fast, and they're all really well written. So having said that, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. That's nice of you. I would like to do a better job of covering some of the sort of species and habitat issues. I think over the past year, it's been a lot of high water and Line 5 and climate goals, and all of which, I wouldn't take any of those off the plate, but I feel for myself a void in that coverage area. And, from a personal interest area, now that we have these goals in place as a state, carbon neutral by 2050, our federal goals as well. The question for me becomes, okay, what does action look like? What does the path to that look like? It's one thing to have a stated commitment. Now we start chipping away at it as a state. So I'm really interested in doing some coverage moving forward that, helps readers and helps all our state understand what it actually looks like to achieve those goals now that they are in place.
And how the economy will change, because it's going to be a real hard shift for some people and a real boon for others. Mike, what's undercovered?
Yeah, dangerous question. You're asking me to ask the journalists who I depend on to get the story out what they're not doing well, but that's okay.
We've got thick skin. Go ahead. Tell us what we should be doing.
No,
we'll tell you why we disagree.
To me, the biggest thing that I think is undercovered, it actually builds on what Kelly was saying, is climate justice, right? And the disproportionate impacts. And, one of the things that I've learned probably belatedly and more recently, and it comes in some of the work that I've done with University of Michigan students in climate activism lately, is that generation, the movement for justice and equity and the movement on climate are the same thing. It's a climate justice movement that's interlocked. I'll put myself on the older category, doing this for many years. I've always thought of those as separate, and that's I think it's actually just wrong. But I think we actually have to retrain ourselves to look at justice is integrally related to everything that we talk about with climate. And I mean that for the activism community, I mean that for the journalism community. And it's a retraining of our thought process on that I think is important for us all. And I'm just, honestly learning and coming around to realize that myself.
The two cities that have taught me more about climate change and equity are Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor. The sustainability managers for those two city governments have really emphasized we can't do anything if we just make it about the people who can afford to make changes. We've got to make sure that the people who can't afford to make changes have the aid necessary to make those changes. And I think that is something that more and more cities across the state are realizing, and hopefully across the nation. I see a couple of people are putting their questions into chat. Please don't use the chat, use the Q&A, because that's where we're going to be pulling the questions from. And let me just pull up and see what we've got here. Let's start with this one. As neighbors to the largest freshwater resources in the country, is there a location maybe in the UP which would be sustainable and safe for our children's children? That's a tough question. Rebecca?
You're throwing me the tough one first. So a location in the UP that would be the most sustainable?
Well, I think that what they're saying is, is there a location anywhere that would be sustainable and safe for our children's children?
Mm-hmm. I guess we have to think about what we mean by sustainable and safe, right? Are we talking about water supply? Are we talking about, being well insulated from temperature changes? That kind of thing?
The Great Lakes region is supposed to be a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? We're supposed to be able to absorb these changes a little better because of our freshwater supply. But let's suppose, as one of our colleagues at the Great Lakes News Collaborative suggests, that we see this huge migration because we do have water while other places don't. I mean, when you consider there might be we've been losing population for so long, it's hard to imagine that we're going to gain a bunch. But if things do get worse in the Southwest, we might see a migration here for fresh water. At that point, where do you think your children's children ought to be thinking about living?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we're talking about temperature, right? I think the farther north you are, the less you would conceivably feel the heat in the summer. But I don't know, Mike, looks like you were going to jump in there.
I guess, the question that, to me, if you back it up, when you see, and maybe some of folks have seen those, the graphs that show you all the places that are going to be less inhabitable because of climate. And what's fascinating about that, Nat Geo has got one of these, they tend to zero in on the most inhabitable, or the best place for our children's children is right here, actually, is Michigan and that sort of northern rim of states, because of just the reasons that Rebecca was talking about, the fresh water access. We're going to have more extreme heat, but that's a different thing talking about it here than Arizona or Florida or something like that. And, I would guess the UP is a great choice among that, because it's a place that's been losing population. So net migration in might be a different thing. But it's an interesting and really hard question, though.
I would point out that
that's why Rebecca threw it my way after a while. I saw that. It was good.
And done, Mike. Actually, Kelly, I thought one of the your pieces recently that I was really fascinated by that relates to this answer was looking at how Lake Michigan is running a fever, as you put it in the headline, and how researchers have found that even the deeper parts of the lakes are getting warmer, and that as we have less ice cover, that can mean more lake effect snow. So if you're talking about where do you want to be, maybe you don't want to be in a place with a lot of lake effect snow in the winter.
And I think that's these questions of, where's the best place to be? Certainly the Great Lakes are considered one of the climate havens and the more resilient. We're not going to have, the sort of dire flashpoint natural disasters in the same way that pose like immediate risk to human lives. But, one thing that has been a central theme of the reporting that Lester and I and our collaborators through the MOP project has been, we have problems now that threaten the very resources that we are so proud of. And, so for me, a big question becomes, do we address those problems before climate change makes them worse? And, it's been interesting to talk to experts on sort of those migration patterns and what we can expect, because half of them, seem to view it as an opportunity almost for a state that has been losing population for a long time and has, a lot of excess infrastructure in parts of the state that, could actually absorb more people. And then others sort of express the concern of, we have toxic contaminants already. We already are pouring too many pollutants into Lake Erie, so part of the question of making sure that there are safe spots in Michigan is actually really a matter of addressing problems that are already known, as much as it is about trying to predict which part of the state is going to be least impacted in the future.
John Gorder asked the question. I'm going to get to it in a second, but DMS 1485 just wrote, just heard Mike reference blow days affecting fishing. I thought our weather has been more windy in the last 10 years than earlier in my life. Is this true? Has it been documented? And is the evidence of climate change? According to my friend Peter Annan, yes, we are getting windier days, greater winds, and it is connected to climate change. This is a fantastic book. It's been updated recently. And he's one of the guys I said at the beginning. I talked to Mike and several other people who are experts around the Great Lakes region about what's happening due to climate change. That's definitely happening. We're seeing more windy days. Now to John's question, how is the state collaborating, or is it, with indigenous communities throughout Michigan to address climate change? Anybody want to tackle that one? Okay, there's a hesitation here. I'm going to jump in with my one little story. I was up in Sault Ste. Marie talking to the Chippewa band there, and they were telling me that they're trying some experiments to deal with repopulating whitefish because, first of all, invasive species has really been rough on whitefish and the population's dropped. But now, because we can't have reliable ice cover on the lakes, and these fish basically are near shore and near rocky areas where they lay their eggs, the ice isn't protecting them from the waves and bashing against the rocks and things like that. So they and the Little Traverse Band are working on experiments on how they can make sure that lake fish reproduce okay. And basically, the state and the feds are looking at what they're doing because they're actually doing something nobody thought of before. And this is not the first time. The Coaster Brook trout, there's a tribe in Minnesota who's been working to do some things to cause the production of the Coaster Brook trout, which you probably haven't seen in Michigan for a while. Very popular fish back in the early 20th century, late 19th century. The fish looks like a rainbow. It's really not to be confused with rainbow trout. It's not that. And it's just a wonderful fish to catch, I'm told. So these tribes are doing some really innovative things that the governments outside of the sovereign tribes are looking at and saying, gosh, why didn't we think of that? And that's my one example. Anybody else got an example about whether the states or the feds are working with the indigenous folks?
I can't answer on whether they're working with the indigenous folks. I don't know. But I just wanted to maybe add another example to what you were talking about, Lester. And this is just outside Michigan, but I had the opportunity 2 summers ago to spend some time at the Bad River Band's reservation. The Bad River Band Reservation is on Lake Superior, just over the Wisconsin border. It's the largest reservation east of the Mississippi. And they have an ecosystem there that I have to admit I was unfamiliar with before I went there, but it's referred to sometimes as the Everglades of the Great Lakes. It is this amazing wetlands complex, and the culture of stewardship there is incredible. And I would venture to say that area is got built-in climate resiliency because of the incredible stewardship of the Bad River Band. We've gotten involved with them because Line 5 cuts right through their property, and they're trying to essentially evict Enbridge from that. But I would, and I don't know whether there's collaboration there, but if the states and the federal government aren't learning from that tribal community and many others, They should be, but I can't say with accuracy whether they are or not.
Anybody else? Okay, I'll move to the next question. Elizabeth Inslee writes, as East and West coastlines slowly disappear, I've heard that Michigan will be a good place to move and live. We talked about that a little bit, but the main point of her question is, if that's so, what is the state planning, if at all, to prepare for an increase in population? I think personally, I think they're so desperate to see more people move into Michigan so that we have some more political clout in Congress and more revenue that that's probably not seen as a problem yet.
Hmm.
I can, you know, it's a tough thing when we say like the state, because there are so many different parts of the state, but I have posed this question of certain folks at the state, and, you know, I don't, at the time when I posed it, it didn't seem like something that was being concretely planned for. And I think part of that may be, you know, I can't speak to their reasoning, but, you know, one of the difficulties in planning is that there is like an extremely widely varying range of predictions for what migration will look like. And, you know, the New York Times did a big piece a few months ago predicting like millions of people moving to the Great Lakes region. I've talked to other scientists who study migration patterns who have questioned whether it would be that dramatic. And so, you know, part of the difficulty in planning, whether it's for migration or for, you know, how our biomes are going to change, is that there is a lot of uncertainty. So you have to be prepared for a pretty wide range of scenarios.
I was going to say, I know that you all in the collaboration have done some reporting on infrastructure, right? And looking at sewage infrastructure in particular, which is, I'd be curious to know what the latest is there, because I'm not as up on that.
That's Lester.
Well, yeah, that is a seriously expensive problem. You know, I've dealt with it in a couple of different ways. One of them that really interests me is Lansing is working and spending a lot of money, up to $5 billion over the next several years to you know, separate its combined sewer operation so that the stormwater sewer is separated from the sanitation sewer, right? So that when they have an overflow or a lot of rain, it doesn't end up having sewage go into it. Grand Rapids is working on the same thing. They're way ahead of Lansing in their things. But the problem is all the little towns in between don't have those kind of resources to clean up theirs. And so while Lansing is doing it, and that will help the cities downstream, and Grand Rapids is doing it, and that will help the cities downstream on the Grand River, all those little communities and all of the farmland in between is still going to be contributing nutrients either from animals, fertilizer, or humans into the Grand River. And that's a problem that it's a macro problem with no dollars to solve it. And if you're a big city, you're mandated. You have been mandated for, gosh, 35 years now to make that separation and do something about it. But I don't know how you're going to solve the problem if only the big cities are dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
So
and this matters because of climate change, and climate change bringing more extreme storm events, which then can cause these sewage overflows into the lakes.
Right, and that brings up a whole other issue. So you're an engineer, you're building a new sewer system for your town, and in the past you always dealt with what have the weather patterns been like historically, and we'll build for that. But they're not going to be the same in the future. They're going to be different because there's going to be it's more volatility, these bigger rainstorms that we've been seeing. So how do you predict how big to build? Because it's expensive to build bigger, you know, so how much insurance do you know, and how much you want to pay for what might happen in the future when you don't know exactly how big you should build and how much money might just be wasted. It's a tough call for communities. It's really, really hard. The other part of that is I was in a little town, and the health department and I were out looking at the problem. The problem was they can't afford the septic systems. They need to be replaced. They're really expensive to replace. And there have been some illegal lines gone into a pipe that actually went into a tributary of the Pine River. And we went down to where this pipe enters into the Pine River. And there is a cesspool of toilet paper and other things in this tributary. And they're trying to trace back who's doing this, what's doing this. And they looked at, as a small community, they've looked at, can we do like a micro sewer system here? And it's, would the residents be willing to pay for that? And it's probably way more expensive and than they can afford, but yet they can't afford to spend tens of thousands of dollars of a sewer septic system replacement. So it's a matter of money and how we deal with that. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have this problem. Now, I've been going on too long. You got me on infrastructure, but that's it's a big problem. Not enough money, and it's I don't know how we're going to deal with it. I really don't, and I don't think the government has an answer, and I don't think anybody else does, unless Mike's got a fund set aside at the National Wildlife Federation to help these folks. I don't know.
Now we're more on the collecting funds and giving them out thing, but but I would say just adding to that is I question whether we can build our way out of this in any case because of the increase in these big precipitation events, and of course take this by bias because I do work for the National Wildlife Federation, but nature-based infrastructure, so things like wetlands, natural ways to hold back water before it gets into the system. Those are the things that have extraordinary benefits because obviously you have benefits for communities, you have benefits for wildlife, you have benefits for water quality, and you're retaining that and eliminating some of the need to build the bigger systems because you don't have water going into them. That doesn't help actually with the problem you were talking about, Lester, because that's a septic problem and that's with sewage directly connecting. But this does help with the problem of water infiltrating rainwater infiltrating your treated water system and overflowing it. And so we do have, it's not the full solution, but remember right now states are flooded with dollars from the COVID relief bills and potentially from the ever elusive and always a few months away infrastructure bills, but maybe they'll actually happen this time. And it's a time to rethink how we capture, treat, and use water in this era of climate change. So there is probably a generational opportunity there. There's never going to be enough money, but there is likely to be a big influx of cash. And states are going to have, and municipalities, choices to make that are going to be generational choices.
Kelly, Reb, can I respond to that just a little bit? I've been ignoring you guys, but I'm going on and on. Two things, Mike. You talked about natural infrastructure. When the Midland dams broke, at the Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, they had just restored a wetland area, and they opened up the gates to let part of that flood water go in. Now, it was able to capture about 3.5 billion gallons of water in that wetland. It's 10 feet high, over 1,000 acres. Now, the water that was released at the dam was like 21 billion gallons. So it's not that, but 3.5 billion gallons probably prevented some downriver community from being flooded as badly and upriver community from being flooded as badly because it was a relief valve, right? It wasn't backing up even more. And so those kinds of things, and you talked about conservationists, the Ducks Unlimited folks designed that for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was built because of conservation dollars going to that. The other thing I wanted to point out is in Grand Rapids, they've got this great program where they're starting to use cement that allows water to be absorbed into the streets. When they're doing parking surfaces, you've got the main street that gets all the traffic, and then you've got the parking surfaces on the sides of the street, and they're using this permeable concrete or permeable asphalt to allow rainwater to soak into the ground rather than run off, run into the sewers, run into the river, and cause that kind of problem. So there are some solutions, but it takes some willingness to think ahead and plan for these things. And that may be where some cities and some communities are falling short. Okay, Kelly, Rep, any observations about these things before I start off on another rant?
No, I think you covered it. Just that question of how to pay for it, but the reality that we do have this influx of cash right now. So it will be interesting to see how communities choose to use it.
Okay, Angela D. Sullivan has a question. Mike mentions algal blooms' contribution to climate change. I also, you also asked about uncovered stories. One story I think that's not being covered is concentrated animal feed operations, CAFOs, or factory farms, and how these contribute to climate change. According to the EPA, animal manure, excess fertilizer applied to crops and fields, and soil erosion make agriculture one of the largest sources of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in the country. It is this nutrient pollution and over-enrichment that is primarily fueling the harmful algal blooms. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts or anyone's thoughts on this, or know if something will be covered in the future or why it's not covered. I will say that this story has been covered widely by the Environment Report when Rebecca was there, by the Toledo Blade. Free Press has done a lot of coverage. I don't know whether Bridge has or not, Kelly, but this is not a story that's been ignored, but it is one that probably needs more coverage. But Rebecca, let's start with you, because I know you cover this a lot.
Well, I've it's been quite a while since I've covered anything related to the CAFOs. Certainly, some of our colleagues have in the past, and you have a bit as well, Lester. But I'm not up to speed on the most recent, to be honest. So.
Yeah, our late colleague Mark Brush did quite a bit of work on CAFOs at one point, but it's one of those things, like, you cover it, and a few people hear it, and then it continues to be a problem, and it seems like it's never been covered. So, Kelly?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I've written a little bit about it. I mean, I wrote recently about the broader question around Lake Erie algal blooms, and the perennial question of whether or not voluntary action alone will solve the problem. Because right now, many of our, the ways that our government has chosen to address farm pollution is by largely giving farmers money for them to volunteer to take, conservation practices on their farm. That didn't delve specifically into CAFOs. But the most recent, the state of Michigan a year or two ago did sort of ramp up the pressure on CAFOs with a new permit that requires a few more things of CAFO owners, but that's in court right now. So I think the tough thing about some of these issues, at least for speaking as a journalist, a lot of times there are 14 things we could cover any day, and we rely upon sort of like the next newsworthy part of that story to bring the issue back up. And those long-standing, sort of issues, I do think sometimes don't get the coverage they deserve because they are not having, the latest decision from a court or, some reason to re-enter into the story.
It's funny, there are so many things happening that are good environmental stories. It's hard to keep up with them. When I first took this job in 1998, my father-in-law asked, how many times can you do a recycling story? Which just showed how limited his idea about what the environment entailed. We've got two questions here about how ordinary citizens can participate. Let me just go through both of them really quickly. Mary asks, says, the Great Lakes are one of our greatest resources. How do we maintain their water quality? What organizations work for Great Lakes water quality, and how can ordinary citizens participate? Eric Williams asks, what is the most effective way for us as citizens to get involved? Where is the greatest bang for the buck? Let's deal with both of those at the same time. Kelly, let's start with you.
That feels like a lot of that feels like a Mike question to me as an
we'll get to him.
But I think it depends what your position is. If you're like an individual landowner who has a garden and a lawn and you're concerned about algae blooms, certainly you could think about what you're putting on your lawn and what kind of fertilizers you use. Obviously, our dietary choices have a variety of impacts. And there are myriad organizations dealing with the Great Lakes. I hesitate to start listing them only because there are so many, and it depends what your interest is. But Mike might have a little bit more of a of a take on that.
Mike, I'm gonna hold you for last. Rebecca, any ideas about what we can do? What can we do that's the greatest bang for the buck?
Well, so I would look at three things. I'd look at diet, right? So we hear a lot that reducing something as simple as reducing how much meat you eat can have a big climate impact because of the greenhouse gases that are associated with meat production. So not necessarily everybody has to become a vegan or a vegetarian, but thinking about, can I reduce some of the meat in my diet? That makes an impact. You can look at your transportation, right? And so the transportation sector has a large impact on climate as well. So with the kind of car that you drive and getting the most fuel efficient, thinking about something like electric, those are choices that you can make. And then another thing that we have done quite a bit of reporting on is getting an energy audit of your home and seeing where can you save energy around your house. And that's something that there are programs. I don't know what the range is, Lester. I know you've reported on this, but for who qualifies, sometimes there are low cost or free energy audits. Other times you have to pay a few $100s to have that done. But that's something that you can do to find out in a pretty quick way, what can I do in my home to save energy and reduce my climate impact?
Yeah, there's a great program that Michigan has that it was, the original seed money was put up by the state in a bipartisan bill. It's called, I think it's called Michigan Saves. Basically, depending on your income, instead of, if you need a new furnace and it costing you credit card interest rates, you can get a loan through a credit union at more reasonable rates. And that's for people of a certain income. And that's become very, very popular. In fact, the guy who does heating and cooling was telling me I always felt guilty to tell him about the loan programs that were out there because I knew they were going to get, excuse the language, screwed over. And now you've got this option. And, if you've got a 20-year-old furnace, it's probably 64, 67% efficient. And just about any kind of heating unit you buy today is more like 97% efficient. So you're not wasting nearly as much energy. Mike, let's just say the National Wildlife Federation is a given for an organization that's working. Can you tell us who are the organizations that are working for Great Lakes water quality, and how can ordinary citizens participate?
Yeah, well, and I feel like the same pressure that I will inevitably leave people out, but we have great collaborators, organizations like the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Freshwater Future, Michigan Environmental Council, Michigan League of Conservation Voters, FLOW, which is a newer group called For the Love of Water. Those are, some of the top five, and we work with, those are my friends and colleagues we work with on a daily basis. And, I think the individual actions that Rebecca was outlining are right on. And then, what we try and work on is get folks to get involved in the political system for those more systemic actions, because it has to be a combination of both, right? Those individual responsibilities. And, we're often working on bills and things, in the legislative process, but ultimately we're working on systemic change, right? Because the problems that we see for the Great Lakes, one way to think about them is they're a result of the success of capitalism. I know that's going to maybe a deeper place on this, but it's kind of like, they're a result of success of modern society. And if we have the same rules for success, we're going to see these problems keep expanding. So we try and work both on the immediate problems in front of us in our homes and our systems, and then we try and work on the kind of those deeper systems of change. And a lot of that is also work with academia, which is often the thought leaders on those pieces.
And the second part of that, those two-part questions was what's the most effective way for us as citizens to get involved? Where is the greatest bang for the buck? What can we do that makes sense, that's worth our sacrifice?
Boy, I don't know if that was me or others. It's so hard because I think that's pure. I'm going to punt on it because it's individual choice. I think people have to, find out where their passion lies, what they can do, and things like that. Because I don't think there's a one size fits all. Some people, their contributions are with their money. They're busy, and so they're going to be donors. Others have no money to spare, but they're going to get out to adopt a road program and clean up trash, or they're going to work on a beach cleanup. And it's individual choice and opportunities, I think, drives that. So I don't have a systemic answer for it.
I don't have an answer to this next question. I don't know. Bob Barnhart asks, does the city of Lansing have a sustainability office? And if so, how effective is it? I don't know if Lansing does. Do any of you?
I don't know.
Sorry, Bob, we can't help you.
Nope.
We just don't know. Michelle Defer asks, are the states and Canada doing anything to stop the invasive quagga mussels, or is it too late? Kelly?
It's too late to stop them. They are, covering virtually every inch of certain parts of Lake Michigan and Huron. I think you can stop them from spreading into places where they have yet to colonize, but and certainly there are efforts to do that. For the lakes where they already are, we now have to live with them. There is not yet a viable, like for lamprey, there was a treatment that, worked and helped suppress lamprey. We do not yet have such a thing for mussels. So their impact on those ecosystems is locked in, and it becomes a question of how do we deal with, the new ecosystem that they've created, unfortunately.
Rebecca?
Oh, I would agree with Kelly on that 100%. I think they're so widespread. I don't think there's much we can do beyond keeping them out of other places they haven't gone yet.
Mike, before I go to you, I'll just say two things about this. Number one, we knew something like this was coming, and we should have, the government, I guess I should say, the governments of Canada and the US should have done something about ballast water on international freighters who come in, because they bring us products and they take very little out of the United States, a little grain sometimes, and other than that, not a lot. So we didn't do anything because the freighters said it would be so terribly expensive for us. But do you have any idea what the cost has been of quagga mussels in the Great Lakes and how detrimental it's been to so many fish species, and not to mention the ones that we can't make money off of, the ecology of the lakes. That is the one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make is we have an invasive species called the round goby. Now, it turns out the round goby likes to eat quagga mussels, and some other fish are native fish are following that pattern. And so it's not going to make a difference, because there are trillions and trillions of quagga mussels on the bottoms of 4 of our lakes. But at least there's a little hope that maybe nature will come into balance. Mike, you got anything to add?
Yeah, no, the same thing. And, there have been these small scale looks at treatment, but when you're talking a problem on the scale of trillions and hundreds, thousands of square miles, it's impossible to think about something that would actually do the treatment that isn't so toxic that it's going to wipe out, nearly everything else. And so, yeah, it's a living with it, minus some breakthrough. I mean, in theory, if you could find some bacterium or something that is very specific to that species and let it loose. But, when we've tried to get rid of invasive species with that, there's almost always the law of unintended consequences. And so from an ecological standpoint, it makes you nervous even to think about how you do that without causing changes we can't even imagine. So it's mostly live with it. And then we still haven't tightened up our regulations enough on ballast water. We've done some. We've actually been in a long-standing lawsuit against the EPA that's gone back and forth for a decade now about tightening up the standards. Because the question is, when these ships, they have water in their ballast. So think of sludge at the bottom that carries species. What kind of treatment do they have to do to kill the critters in there before it's released? And the shipping industry is still fighting against strong standards on that. We have pretty weak ones right now.
When I first started covering the environment in Michigan, in the Great Lakes region, I think there were like 34, 40 invasive species that they were concerned about. And now there's more than 140 in just that time. We got a political question. You guys ready for a political question? All right, this comes from Tom and Ann Wywoody. Hi, Ann, how are you? Can you talk about how the legislature is proposing to undermine funding for EGLE, in particular the House seeking quarterly funding instead of annual or 2-year funding as in the past? Who wants to tackle that?
I am not up on that. So Mike or Kelly?
Well, I put out an angry quote about it a couple of days ago, so I'm fairly up on it. And hi to Tom and Ann, my good friends who asked this question. And what happened, right, is that the Michigan House Republicans proposed budgets that come out in 25% increments, and actually cuts on top of that to our state environmental agencies, the DNR and the EGLE, which is Environment and Great Lakes and Energy Agency. And, there's multiple problems with that. One is that the cuts would cut out some critical functions in the agencies. But even if we set that aside, you can't effectively run agencies that deal with long-term problems like climate, like invasive species, that actually keep our state parks open by funding them in 3-month cycles. I'd note that when Rick Snyder was a governor, the same Republican lawmakers were insisting on a 2-year cycle for the budget, saying 1 year wasn't enough to plan. So to now say, because they are political opponents of Governor Whitmer, that we need to budget in 3-month increments it's patently ridiculous. It's not a way that you can run the government, and it's particularly ridiculous when you're talking about resource challenges over time. So yeah, I've got strong feelings about that one, and I was quoted, fairly strongly about that just a few days ago when this came out. Oh, you're muted, Lester.
Muted myself. Sorry about that. Neil has a related question, and he says, we can't only use regulation to get us to a better spot in this region. We need business too, but business works best when they understand the value proposition for them to letting climate change run wild on the Great Lakes. Do you think there's enough reporting and focus on the economics of climate change in our region in order to bring business more on board with change? Rebecca?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm always in favor of more reporting on most topics. I think you can't really, like you said, Lester, repeat things enough and do enough of an in-depth job on a lot of these topics. You can always do more. I do think we actually have seen quite a bit of change in the business community, though, over, I'd say, the past 20 years or so. So there's a lot more pressure from businesses on politicians to do more. We've seen that recently, that there's a lot more to do, but a number of corporations have seen that this is the way that things are going, and that more action needs to happen faster. And of course, industry always wants one single national standard or goal. They don't want a patchwork of regulations and rules within states or things that they have to meet in different states.
Kelly?
I think, I would echo what Rebecca just said. One thing that I think too, you're starting to see is not just, there's a growing recognition amongst everyone, right? That climate change is happening. We need to reckon with it in whatever way you might be talking about in that moment. I think too, you're starting to see more business opportunities in sort of the industry of responding to climate change, or the blue economy or renewable energy. As these things have become more viable technologies, I think certainly it becomes more palatable for folks who are focused mainly on their bottom line, either to adopt these things or to be pursuing business opportunities of their own in those particular industries. So I've definitely seen some of that. As far as whether there's enough coverage, I think that there are not enough journalists in the world, period. So any, issue that you ask me if there's enough coverage on, I'm going to tell you no.
And certainly a lot fewer environmental journalists. I mean, there are not as many people as were 20 years ago covering the environment. Mike, you got any perspective on this?
Well, yeah, maybe a quick thing, which is that, one of the more exciting things that I've been involved with in the last several years is the formation of this group that I mentioned briefly when I was holding up my beer at the beginning of this program, the Great Lakes Business Network. And it's an example. So this is a group of businesses largely in the recreational tourism and brewery industry, but it's got some bigger names like Patagonia and Bell's Brewery and a lot of smaller mom and pop shops and some iconic places like Shepler's, Mackinac Ferries, and Cherry Republic. But what's interesting is they came together around the issue of Line 5 and said, hey, if Line 5 ruptures, our businesses are toast, right? But then this group started working on climate change legislation and worked in that state, going, if we're not addressing the deeper underlying factors that are a problem for water quality and a problem for habitability, we're not doing our work. So we're seeing this bubbling up from business, and it's also a group of businesses that self-organized and asked us in the nonprofit sector, can you help us be more effective as advocates? I've never had that before. I mean, we're knocking on the doors of businesses all the time saying, hey, join us. This came the other way. They knocked on our door and said, we're interested, but we don't know how to influence lawmakers. That's not what we do. That's your job. And so that gives me some hope. I don't know about coverage. I agree that we're woefully understaffed, and we have amazing environmental reporters in the state on this call and elsewhere, but way too few of them. So it's hard to think of an area where there's enough coverage given that.
I've got allergies, so I keep clearing my throat, so I keep turning the mic off, so my apologies. I'm going to make a couple of observations about this, and I'm going to tell you right up front, these are opinion and anecdotal. I've watched as Fortune 500 companies have realized, hey, you know what? LED lighting and more efficient heating and cooling is going to save us money in the long run, and we can basically sell that idea as being green. And other smaller companies have followed that. I've seen a lot of small businesses, just the owner and the handful of employees are all on board, and they're saying, look, this is our ethos. We are green, or as green as we can be. And there are some mid-sized companies who are also doing that, but then there's a whole bunch of them that are just saying, I don't have time for government regulation. I don't want to deal with government regulation. I'm not going to deal with government regulation unless I absolutely am forced to. And that is where we're at with the economy. The larger corporations, I believe most of them are saying it's not only good business, but it's good for the climate. And we have a whole generation of people younger than me and Mike anyway, who are saying, this is the most important issue in our life. We see our world ending if you don't deal with climate change. And those businesses are saying that's a really important sector of our business. So we're going to listen to them because we want to make sure that we continue to have customers. And I think it's driven by the profit motive in a little bit, but it's also driven by the realization that we're dealing with some catastrophic issues if we don't get a hold of them soon. I wish everybody in business, business owners, business operators were on board with that. They're not, but a lot more of them are than were 20 years ago. So there's hope there. All right, let's go to the next question. By the way, so this was supposed to go till 8 o'clock. Rebecca, you're still on duty for editing at Michigan Radio. Can you go another, 10 or 15 minutes?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, all right. Travis asks, what kind of active incentives does the state of Michigan or federal government offer the commercial scale private business here in Michigan that are in renewable green tech space, such as solar and wind, and what kind, if any, training support to transition employees from extraction to renewable type industries? There are some training programs. I'm aware of those. I'm not sure what kind of active incentives there are from state or federal government for renewable energy programs. Mike, I'm going to start with you because you probably have dealt with that more than any of us.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not as up to speed on that. Michigan had strong state incentives when we passed our first renewable energy standard, which is the requirement for a certain percentage of energy to come from renewable sources under Governor Granholm. So we're going back 10 years plus now. I believe most of those incentives are no longer in place. They've faded out over time, but that's in part because the industry has matured so much that we have, and Michigan is well positioned on this because of our skilled labor force, because of our manufacturing base in solar technology and in wind technology. But I'm not up on what the current incentives are from a manufacturing perspective, a little outside the scope of what I've been working on.
Kelly?
I cannot claim to be an expert on this either. And if you're talking about for individuals or small, businesses versus big industrial folks, the state, I do know that there's a green bank in Michigan that's widely regarded that helps people finance, smaller green energy projects of their own. I think it may apply to businesses, certainly applies to individuals. And, one of the big conversations around the UP has been, what to do about the energy there if Line 5 is disrupted for any reason. And a lot of the conversation there has dealt with expanding, existing programs that help people pay to insulate their homes, or things that maybe are not on their face clean energy, but efficiency is a really, talk about things we don't cover enough. I think like questions about energy efficiency and the simple things that we could all do to reduce our energy footprint, even if we still are getting our energy from non-renewable sources. That's a big area, particularly for folks who live in homes that are leaky. And I do know that there are programs to incentivize, making efficiency upgrades in that way.
Before I turn to Rebecca, I just want to make a friend of ours, Matt Grokoff. Everybody seems to be enamored with the idea of getting rooftop solar, but what he always preaches again and again is reduce, then produce. In other words, get your home really tight and efficient, buy insulation. No, it's not sexy, but it'll do you more good in the short term. And then once your house is nice and tight and well insulated and you're doing as well as you can, then if you want to think about a solar panel, think about doing that. Rebecca, sorry.
No, I don't have that much to add to this, actually, to this answer. So.
The next question, I'm just going to answer it real quickly. What is the possibility of the West or the South pulling water from the Great Lakes, and what are the Canadians concerned with and doing? I can tell you that we've dealt with this issue for more than 2 decades now, and we've studied it and we've looked at it. And the fact is, you would have to build so many power plants to build the pumping stations to get Great Lakes water out west. It ended up costing more than would ever be worth. As far as the South, they're already getting some of the Great Lakes water through the Chicago Canal to the Illinois River and Mississippi. I'm not sure what more they could ask for. This is a great question. This is from Arthur Luss. What are the top 3 interventions that homeowners can do to address climate change, best return for investment? We talked about that a little bit. Let's just talk about what homeowners can do to their houses. Reb, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we touched on this a little bit earlier. So I think you could start with an energy audit, right? Which would be like getting an expert in to go around and point out where your house is leaky, right? So where are you leaking energy? I think looking at your appliances is a really good place to start too. Lester, you mentioned that things have really improved a lot with energy efficiency. And certainly things like, we just put a new roof on not that long ago because we were losing a lot of energy through our roof. So there's certainly things like that, but there are also many lower cost things that you could do.
Kelly?
I don't have anything to add beyond that. Yeah, I think it's just, again, the efficiency question, finding ways to make your home more efficient, whether that's through appliances or insulation or any other, way to reduce your energy footprint.
Mike?
Yeah, and I've been trying to get my home down to net zero, and I think it applies fairly universally. The energy audit, and it almost always says homes are under insulated. That's almost a given in this climate. And then looking at the appliances and furnace and things like that, that's where a big source. And then I totally agree with my friend Matt Grokoff. You reduce, and then you produce. And so I put solar on my home. It's amazingly affordable. The return on investment is about 8 years. I put solar systems on 2 homes, and it's been just about that. So if you're planning on, even if you're not thinking about the environmental benefits, if you're going to be in a home longer than 8 years, solar is already a good return. And that's in Michigan. We don't have the best climate for solar here, so it's impressive.
I'm also told that geothermal seems to be a really good return on investment too. I've not done either of those, so I don't know personally, but there's a man in my town who did geothermal, and I'm not talking about the round ones where you've got a lot of property. I'm talking about deep well geothermal, and he said, now I get my power bill and I laugh. So that's good, right? So this is a psychological question, and it's tough, and I'm not sure there's any answer to this because people believe what they believe, and trying to convince them is different. But Belinda asks, how do you talk to someone who denies that humans have any role in climate change and so can have any effect on diminishing it, to persuade them otherwise? Open question. Anybody want to tackle that?
I don't know about the interpersonal piece. That'd be an interesting question for a psychologist, but just from a journalistic standpoint, my own personal practice, and I know the practice that many environmental journalists have adopted, is to just stop acting as though, there's not cater to the doubt. It's a fact. It's written as fact. I don't write about it with hesitation or credence to those arguments. And I do sometimes wonder, the way that we all consume media, and in some ways it's easier than ever to isolate yourself into your own worldview and not have to, consume media that doesn't comport with that. Sometimes I wonder if you don't believe it now, if you ever will. So that's my own personal question, is it possible, but maybe that's just my jaded journalist perspective.
Cynic. I'm with you though. I mean, people are going to believe what they want to believe. Anybody else want to tackle that?
The one thing I'd say from the social psychology literature on this is, the premise of the question might be flawed, because someone who's passionate about this talking to someone who's a climate denier almost never works, right? It's the people in your social reference group. And so when we've gone to influence, and I'll go back to kind of where I started, the hunter and anglers who tend to be, not universally, but tend to be much more conservative. When we talk about climate, we don't go in with liberal environmentalists who are vegetarians to go talk to them. Right. So it's about people who enjoy the same things. It's about talking about the impacts on what they care about, their lake, the species that they're hunting, and folks within that reference group, because that conversation has no chance of success if it doesn't start within people's dominant social reference group. Because, what we've learned, there's a very famous study where you had climate deniers and folks who believe in the science, if you put it that way, read the exact same New York Times article, and which is really a factual article if you look at it. And both groups believed it confirmed their existing worldview, right? So the exact same text, the denier said, oh, well, I read this article and it shows that climate change isn't real. And then the folks on the side of science said, I read this article and it shows that I'm scared because of this. And that's because of it's the social reference group that matters.
I just want to apologize. We're getting so many questions so fast that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I apologize for that. But a lot of them are asking for specifics on what they can do at home. And is there a good website to go to? And if any of you have anything, I'm sorry, Rep, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just that, we're running out of time and we got, like 30 questions here. So go ahead. What
I was just gonna jump onto what Mike said, and that everybody I've interviewed on that topic of communicating climate change talks about meeting people where they are. So I just kind of reiterate that is really finding out what they care about the most, and that there are a lot of people who work in communication of climate change who talk about connecting with people, whether it's if it's through a worldview of religion or something like that, and it's about stewardship, versus, or talking to hunters and fishers about how things have changed with climate change. It's really, there are a lot of people who talk about how the language that you use matters.
I love public radio listeners because they're so curious. Susan Rose looked it up and says, Lansing does have a sustainability office with a sustainability manager, appears to have been started last year. So thank you, Susan. We've got another question here. Concerning invasive species, is it realistic to say the shipping bringing in invasive species is costing far more money than they're worth? Is it worth it having a shipping industry? There was a study, and it's been a few years ago, but there was a study at the Grand Valley State University that indicated that we were losing far more money because of invasive species than we gained because of international shipping. I don't know if that's changed, the calculus has changed at all, but.
Well, maybe I can jump in on this one. I don't remember the exact dollar amounts, but that is true. And folks have to remember, most of the shipping in the Great Lakes is by what's called lakers, ships that never leave the Great Lakes. Most of the transport is, think of it like raw materials from Minnesota going down to Detroit or Chicago, and that is what most of the transport is. So the relatively small amount that's international actually has very little benefit compared to the invasive species cost. In fact, the best proposal and what National Wildlife Federation supports, although it's been politically hard, is simply shutting down that international transport, letting ships actually offload when they get to that point on the St. Lawrence Seaway. You can do a small bit of trucking and rail and then only allow lake to lake. I mean, there's actually a pretty simple solution to that, but the politics of it are tough. They're actually tougher on the Canadian side. It's a bigger percentage of the shipping from Canada, and they're very reluctant to shut it down. The St. Lawrence Seaway is a more major economic player for them than it is for the U.S.
And when you talk to a congressman in Minnesota, they're going to say this is the best shipping for grain out of the Great Lakes, even though they're really close to the Mississippi River and could easily barge it down to Louisiana. We're running out of time here, but I've got actually more than a couple of questions here about bees. How can Michigan support this lifeline for the human race? We keep bees, our neighbors continue to use poisons on their lawns. What's the likelihood that will change? We haven't talked about bees at all. It's responsible for a lot of what's on our plates. Who wants to tackle that one? Who's done work on that? I'm looking at you, Rebecca.
Yeah, I can feel you looking at me. Let me look at the questions one more time. Let's see. Best ways to support bees. I mean, the thing that I've heard the most probably is that what you plant in your yard matters a lot. One story that I did a while ago was looking at the importance of making sure that the plants that you buy are not treated with pesticides called neonicotinoids. And that's because those are harmful to pollinators. So that's one thing that you can do when you are trying to buy plants, is talk to the people who you're buying them from. And you can, there are a lot of smaller nurseries that are aware of this. And some bigger companies have labeled plants that say these plants don't contain neonicotinoids, or these plants are not treated with pesticides that hurt pollinators. And those are things that you can look for in the label, but there's not any kind of universal labeling. So the best thing you can do is do your research and then plant native plants that belong in this region and that attract bees. And it's not just the bees. You don't have to keep bees to help bees either. Keeping bees does help, that's good. But there are a lot of other native pollinators that live in our region that are not honeybees, which are actually not native. And you can help bees by just looking at what you're planting in your yard.
Unless somebody has something else to add about bees, I'm going to go to our last question. Is that okay? Kelly, you sure you don't have something to say about bees? Okay, Mike, no bees?
No, sorry.
What Rebecca said was right on, something everyone can do.
All right, so this is from Jordan Dishinger Speedis. I hope I got your name right. I'm a high school teacher with a few students interested in environmental journalism. What advice do you have to high school seniors and college freshmen interested in the profession? Kelly?
Well, I just was direct messaging Jordan because I didn't know if you'd get to that question. When I think back about my pathway to this, I think in hindsight, I wish I had taken more environmental courses and fewer journalism courses as an undergrad, because I think certainly, there's valid training in university settings as it pertains to journalism, but the journalism you can learn in the field. You learn by doing. The science stuff, I think, does a lot of times require a different level of training. And in hindsight, I just wish I had taken more science-oriented classes.
I'll point out that Kelly also has a master's degree in environmental law, so she's no slacker.
Well, that's because I went back and realized, man, I need to up my game on this, because my undergrad was all focused on, the act of reporting rather than the expertise of the environment.
Rebecca, you do have that science background. What's your suggestion?
Yeah, and that was, I actually sort of fell into environmental journalism. I thought I wanted to be a scientist of some kind. And then I worked in the lab studying diatoms and decided that I was interested in a much broader field of things. And I thought, well, maybe something like journalism would be good. And I, in my case, just tried it, right? So our late colleague Mark hired me at Michigan Radio 21 years ago, and I figured I would learn it on the job. And that is exactly, I would agree with what Kelly said, that my science background, my science degree really has helped a lot in my career. But there are also a lot of different training opportunities. And one of them that's really, really good is for folks who are out of college and in early career in particular, is the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources. So there are programs like that will take early or mid-career journalists who want to learn more about environmental journalism and do these expedition immersion style trainings that are fantastic. And they helped me a lot. And Lester, I know you've gone as well.
So Mike, you were a college educator. What's your advice for a high school teacher with a few students interested in environmental journalism?
Yeah, I think the key thing is communication skills overall. And I'd say in the nonprofit sector, we are constantly in need of and always look at who are good communicators. And journalists are obviously, top notch in terms of communicators. And we're always looking for folks on our team. I mean, we are hiring right now for someone, a communications coordinator. But I'd say in every one of our issue areas, we can it's actually a little bit the inverse of what Kelly was saying, so sorry about that, but we can kind of teach some of the knowledge areas, but if people don't have basic strong communication skills, it's hard for us to get them in a place where they're strong advocates. So I think that skill set is what I'm always talking to my current and former students. I still teach some climate change classes at U of M, so I'm still working with students, and it's always about how do you effectively communicate your positions? How do you advocate strongly, fact-based, and with strong communications? And I think that carries through in the field, all fields, I guess, but I think of it through this lens.
Folks, I'm really sorry that we can't get to all of your questions. I really appreciate them. We've been reading ahead and looking at them, and we're just not able to get to all of them. So I'm going to leave you with this. I'm going to thank our panelists, Rebecca Williams, who's an editor at Michigan Radio, Kelly House, reporter for Michigan Environment Watch at Bridge, Michigan, and Mike Schreiberg, regional director of the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes Regional Center. I want to thank all of you. You guys have been great tonight. You didn't drink as much as I did, but you've still been good. I also want to thank the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation for underwriting tonight's event. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope we asked at least most of the questions you wanted to hear from us. And we hope that we get to do this again before next Earth Day. We'll do it sooner, I hope. Thanks very much.
And if things go better than they are now.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Good night, all.
So.
We all done, I guess?